Just a bit of an introduction before I begin. I am a born and raised Wisconsinite. Went to all the way through the Lutheran system, from grade school all the way through college. I'm a MEC1 alumni here, so it's nice to be back. I currently teach at Zion Lutheran Academy in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I've been teaching there for the last 4 years. Prior to that, I taught here in Wisconsin at, first of all, Bethlehem Lutheran for 4 years, and then Pilgrim Lutheran for 5 years before moving to Indiana. So that gives you an idea of at least how long I've been teaching and where I've come from. My topic today is a classical approach to literacy. While it is pretty much an overview, it is still, I will try to provide as much insight. Since I do teach 5th and 6th grade currently, you'll get an idea of some of the things that I've been doing. This is based on research for approximately 2 years. I gave a presentation here last year at the conference, and this is very similar to that, but it also brings in a little bit of new research that I found. I start today with a quote from C.S. Lewis from The Abolition of Man. "We make men without chess and expect of them virtue and enterprise." Literature today is an intellectual wasteland. And where do we begin? It is a real mess. It actually started back, well, long before this, but I'll only go back to the 1960s. In 1967, there was a book that came out called Learning to Read, The Great Debate. And this was put out by Jeannie Shaw, or maybe Shaw, I'm not sure the pronunciation there. She did a Harvard study between 1962 and 1965, and then came out with a book in 1967. And this basically went through all of the studies up to that point, and she ran also her independent studies of phonics and sight reading. Which was better? In 1967, this was a huge debate. Well, sounds like today, doesn't it? It still rages on. Going through all of the research and studies that had been done, she came down clearly for two aspects. One, that phonics was the way to go. That in the early years for sight reading, children may get a head start. Then as time goes on, they fall behind others that have phonics because they've not been given the skills. And if you cannot decode words, can't get the meaning, and everything else in your educational career will not work out. So she also decided that not only is phonics important, but challenging literature. Without those two together, there was no hope for a child to be successful. She also found out in later years, and she did a revised edition in 1983, which took everything up from 1967 through 1981 and brought it current, that children who lack family support must rely on teachers for their literacy education. So where are we today? We are in the same similar situation. How many children do have parents that can help them every step of the way? As parents both working, it's not always an opportunity. With children that come from single-family homes, there is also, again, not an opportunity. So the burden falls on teachers. And again, she came out with a book, and, well, actually, she passed away, Ms. Shaw did, in 1999, and they published this book after her death in 2000 called Academic Achievement Challenge. And she went through her 50 years in the teaching career. She started out as a classroom teacher and ended up at Harvard's graduate school as a professor. And she said there are two approaches. It's the traditional approach, which is teacher-centered, and there's progressive approach, which is child-centered. And the choice of parents and school boards generally is the traditional approach, the teacher-centered approach. The choice of education professors and teachers is the child-centered approach, or the progressive approach. And she said, as she went through studies and she visited schools, the one that has the most successful outcomes is the teacher-centered approach. Now, everything from teacher education that I went through here a long time ago and everything that is currently out there today is all child-centered approach. You are told that you are not to be a teacher. You are not to be dominant in the classroom. You are to be a facilitator. And all studies prove that this is wrong, and it does not work, and it is not successful. So as time goes on, she also, and several of her students, went to look at the reading textbooks that children were given. And traditionally, we're talking about basal readers. Those textbooks which have a controlled reading vocabulary. And not only is the vocabulary is controlled, but they also have stories which tend to be written by in-house writers. Besides for that, in the 1980s, there started to be a trend, a shift, where they wanted more literature. Well, and we'll say literature in quotes, not necessarily good literature, but they wanted literature. They wanted stories that had been written by real authors in textbooks. So the textbook companies, the publishers, shifted gears. And they moved to put some good literature in there. But unfortunately, they were only excerpts. We never had a full novel in there. If they did, it was very rare. They sometimes had medal or award-winning literature. They often paraphrased it or summarized it. Sometimes you only had chapters. Or occasionally you would get the whole novel, and not usually. So what were the problems then that we have? Well, a student of Shaw's, a woman by the name of Susan Stotsky, also from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She currently has another title, which is rather long. She is the Commissioner for Academic Affairs of the Massachusetts Department of Education. And she ran several studies. She took textbooks, basal readers, from grades 4 and 6, from the top 6 publishers between the years of 1993 and 1993 and 1995. And she found some incredible results. The kinds of selections now featured in the readers make it impossible for the children to develop a rich, literate vocabulary in English over the grades. And again, the amount of time students spend decoding words which they will rarely, if ever, see again, she refers to as wasting their intellectual energy. She states that the time spent in the classroom on intellectually barren topics that draw on intellectually limited vocabulary deprives students who most need it of opportunities to practice using the lexical building blocks necessary for conceptual growth and analytical thinking. She also went back and took a look at some of the things in the textbooks. To start with, a few definitions. Diversity, something we hear much about today. Traditionally, diversity meant individual differences. Today, it means looking at a student as a representative of a particular demographic category. And a multicultural aspect of this was traditionally meant to include all American citizens. And she refers back, Ms. Stotsky does, to when she went to school. And she went to school in a public school in Massachusetts. And she said many of the things in her textbooks were pretty stereotypical. You know, it was basically white Americans. That's all you would see. And she said, yet in her class, there were many different nationalities in her classroom. But they were taught a variety of things. And I'll move on to that in a moment. But first of all, she said that what multiculturalism has done today is twist history in some cases. Instead of showing true ethnic nature of America, it shows only a narrow minority. So instead of adding to what was there, they took much away. And what they added was only from the minority groups, and they got rid of a lot of the rest. And so again, the pendulum swung too far to the other direction. Many inventions and discoveries have been left out because they were considered to be done, only by one ethnic group, so they left them out. Some basal selections put women and other minorities in places in history where they were not at that time. So historically, it was incorrect. And again, this comes from her studies of these publishers' textbooks. She also says that it impedes civic identity and responsibility. If students cannot identify with one another as Americans, they will not be able to agree to work together for the country's good. She goes over and over that when she went to school, because most of the children at school were all immigrants, and a lot of people at home didn't speak English, the parents wanted the children to learn English. They wanted them to know that they were Americans. And that was the big thing. They didn't want them to know that they were Polish Americans or Irish Americans or anything like that. It was that they were Americans. And she said, and they never specifically went out of their way to tell them to practice tolerance, to be tolerant of other cultures, but they modeled it for them. The children saw them doing that. They knew that they were each different, but when problems came up within the classroom or the playground, the teachers dealt with it, and the children saw them modeling that. And she believes that teachers need to do that more today. More of something that is seen, less talk about it. She also says that the thinking and reading process of children is hindered, and that you need to give them this rich language which is found in good literature. And instead of that being offered to the children, it's being more often withheld for a variety of reasons. Sometimes, well, it's too difficult for them. They can't handle it. They're struggling through it, and we don't want them to struggle. Or it's not appropriate for them. You know, either they won't be able to identify with it. And so again, it's withheld from them. So this is the mess that we're in. So what would be the cure? Well, we look back to the ancient Greek education. Plato gives us some good examples, not the only, but he does give us some good. He suggested that between the ages of 10 and 13, they should be able to decode, they should become orally fluent, and they should learn important quotations. First passages that students received were from Homer and Euripides. They didn't mind that it was difficult. They were to tackle that. They were to endeavor. They were given poetry, a big emphasis on poetry. They were required to memorize long poems, eulogies, and stories. He believed in censorship. Anything that demeaned the ancient gods, Greek gods, or anything that did not make the Republic look good or appear in a good light, they were not to see at that point when they were learning. They started copybooks. What was copied down one day from dictation was the next day's reading lesson and was taught. Copybooks carried on even into our founding fathers. We have some of the things that George Washington had in his copybook. And we, go through some of those with our students yet today. And he highly believed in repetition. And that was important, that he went over and over and over until the children learned what they needed to learn. When we moved on to the Romans, of course, they took what the Greeks was good, they expanded it, and they systematized it. During the Middle Ages, we have the example of Charlemagne, who thought education was of the most important. He wanted to read and write, and he brought all the scholars into his court. And during the Renaissance, you've probably heard this, but not only a scholar, but an athlete, a captain of armies, a wise ruler, and a patron of the arts, the all-around man, the liberally educated. Okay, and of course they look back to the Greeks and the Romans. So what does that leave for our necessary future? What do we need to do? If we educate to, and this is a quote from Lewis again, not to cut down the jungles, but irrigate the deserts. You will receive into your household or into your classroom many problems that these students come in with. What they see on TV, what they hear, everything that's out there. But it is not necessarily your job to spend your whole time cutting down. If you spend your time doing that, you will have no time to teach. So you must provide them with the good things that are out there. Offer students only the literature that leads them down the path that leads them to a virtuous man or a virtuous woman. Now, how do we pick that literature? At the Academy, we took 2 summers. Well, 2 years technically. 1 year to study and to look for lists and to see what was out there, and then 1 year to argue about it and come up with our list. It is difficult. To define the word classic when it comes to literature is not an easy task. A brief test that we would use is generally 50 years. If it's lasted at least 50 years, it's worth at least looking at. Whether we choose it or not is another situation. So we gathered lists that were out there. We looked at the core knowledge curriculum. We looked at Bennett's list of Book of Virtues. We looked at all the lists around. We combined all the lists, and we went through them. And then we found that there were things that weren't on the list, and then we added them to our list. And then came the time when we had to divide them by grade level. And we would say, no, that's too hard. They can't do it. But we said they need to get this. They need to try it. And so we implemented the first year, and we went to our headmaster, and we said, these are the books we need for this year. All of them. He said, okay. And he got them. And we thought, oh boy, now we've got to make sure we get through all of these. He spent all of this money. And we went through the books, and we ran into problems, and we kept notebooks on things, and we took notes, and you had to write, in many cases, all your own worksheets, all your own quizzes, all your own tests. You had to do your own background knowledge, and it took time. I think the teachers probably learned more than the students did that first year around, going through everything. And as we went through it, we found there were problems. Some books we just couldn't use. Some books that we thought would be good, they just weren't good. They didn't work out. So we found then, oh, we missed a book. Someone brought a book to our attention. That was a good book. We read it. It fit in. We moved it. But then we had the concern, how are we going to get the children interested? You know how they say, well, if it's a good book, it will come. But as teachers, we're worried anyway. We know what kids are like. And the first year that I taught, one of the books I was using are Tales from Shakespeare. And the students heard Shakespeare, and they go, oh, no. We're not going to study that boring guy, are we? Start out with a biography about him a little bit, about his video, and they go, that's interesting. Can we just continue to watch this and skip the book? And I said, no. And by the time we got done with Tales from Shakespeare, and I didn't even do all of them because there was more I needed to cover, they said, well, can't we finish these? And if we can't finish these, can I buy the book off of you and keep it? Well, you know you're getting somewhere. They saw a picture on a mug, and they go, oh, I know that. That's the Shakespeare dude guy. We know who he is. And they would get to the point where, and I've got 5th and 6th graders, so we could discuss. And we would discuss, well, Shakespeare says that she was a virtuous woman. What does that mean? And it took us a long time to kind of drag that out of them, what that actually meant. And it took them time. But this year, when I said to the class, because I've got 2 grades, 1 grade that was coming, I said to the 6th graders, what is a virtuous woman? They said, don't even ask her that. Don't even ask her because you don't know where she's going to go with that. And they remembered it, and they knew, and they were able to tell the 5th graders what it was to be a virtuous woman or a man, and whatever the case may be. So it took us some time, and we're constantly revising. We have our list out there on the table, and some of you probably have seen that. And again, while it is current as it is now, there are still revisions going on. So it is an ongoing process that probably will never end until we get to the point where we're very satisfied. Sometimes we couldn't get through as much as we thought we could. Sometimes we decided that maybe we needed to add a little bit more. Maybe we needed to take some more away. Some books were too easy for some grades. We had to move them on. In 1 grade, they read a book called Paddle to the Sea, where you have this Indian boy that carves this boat, and he puts it on in Canada on a snowbank, and when it melts, it goes into the Great Lakes, and it follows the Great Lakes all the way through the St. Lawrence Seaway till it gets to the ocean. And one of the children that had the hardest time reading, he has trouble decoding, and he's just having a rough time. He was the kid at the end of the book, when the boat made it to the ocean, started to cheer, that he was so happy that the boat made it. And it was this excitement in the literature. Students that would come up to me and ask me, Mrs. Hughes, can I read on, please? Do you mind if I read ahead? By all means. Why would I want to stop that? So there were encouraging signs, and our concerns with whether our students would be excited or not, and even their initial reaction is it being, oh no, it's going to be boring, it's long, it's thick, they soon got over, and it worked well. We also need to offer literature that has not been altered to make it easier. But we need teachers who strive to help their students hit the mark. Some of the books that we received, especially when you're looking for classics, you'll find a lot of them are adapted or paraphrased. And I don't know how many books that we ordered and thought it was the real thing and found out it was abridged or it was adapted in some way, and we end up having to send it back. Now, the only one that I do use, and I need to make clear, was the Tales from Shakespeare. That is a paraphrase, but they get the real Shakespeare in 7th and 8th grade, so it prepares them for the storyline. But I know I don't like abridgments and paraphrases, but this is a really good one, so that's my only exception. Literature also, needs to give students heroes, true heroes, for students to look up to. If you ask them to write or tell you who their hero is, you're bound to get all the sports and movie stars and music pop stars that you can possibly find. But literature will give them true heroes. An example, Horatio Hornblower, if you've read any of the Hornblower series, or maybe if you've seen the mini-series, at least in the first books, we use one of them as a read-aloud. It gives them the example of a young ideal type, someone who's going through the struggle to be virtuous. Wilfred of Ivanhoe, I read to my class this year, Ivanhoe. We made it through the whole book as a read aloud. And they got excited, they followed, they understood what he went through, the changes that took place in him. And if you've seen Gladiator, I guess, and some of you have, hopefully, Maximus from Gladiator shows you the mature ideal type, or possibly Ben-Hur is a good example of someone who goes from a young man, and as he goes all the way through, you see the maturing, you see the ideal type, the striving that they go through. And literature must provide fairy tales as windows into the real world, especially in the early years. And we've even had a few parents object to some of the Grimm's fairy tales and some of the Perrault's fairy tales and saying they're too gory and things like this. But realize what they're watching on TV today and the books that they're reading, the R.L. Steins and things like that, and which teach nothing really. Whereas the fairy tales, they're able to confront these monsters and be able to deal with them in a vicarious way. Something that C.S. Lewis said, "Since it is so likely that they will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker." We also need literature that has biographies and autobiographies of remarkable people. And this, in and of itself, is a challenge to find. In the younger years, you'll find many biographies and autobiographies, well, mainly biographies, especially in the Founding Fathers and things like that. But it's as you get to the middle and especially the upper grade years, it is very hard to find one that does not have a political agenda to it. It is very difficult to find one that just tells of the accomplishments. And one probably that you may not be aware of, but as Lutherans it's an excellent one, is one about Rosa Young, who started Concordia in Selma, Alabama, and her fight to bring the faith and how she was a Lutheran in her struggle. It's an incredible book and something that our students, need to read and things that they need to hear about. So there are excellent biographies and autobiographies out there, but it takes time to find them. And you eventually find that you have too much to fit in. You do not have enough time in the day. And so you start to slide things into history and into science. And so that, and into math, some biographies of some of the great mathematicians, things that they have not heard before. Even if it is, we have a book, for example, that talks, 8 minutes. It's a one page that you read about a mathematician. Those are the sorts of things that these children need. They need to see the intellectual, heroes and things that have happened. They need to hear those things. And last but not least, literature that realizes the impact of poetry. The poet says in few words that so many cannot say in unlimited words. Poetry is so important. The Greeks probably rated it higher than anything. And yet today, you have to watch the modern poetry. Even the poet laureates in many cases are very poor. I don't know if it's this year, but the last poet laureate of England did a new translation of Beowulf, I believe. Look at that wrong there. And it's an amazing translation. He went back, he studied it, he tried to make it in the sing-song, the poetic melody that it would flow for people to read today, and it hit the top bestseller list. So there is poetry out there. There is ancient poetry. And there's so many things that you can do with it. One of our teachers, for example, takes a poem, they read it, they discuss it, the children may memorize it, they draw a picture depicting what the poem is about, especially ones which are using a lot of descriptive words. There is so much. Longfellow wrote a poem about Martin Luther that our headmaster found, something that we had not seen before. Years ago, Longfellow was basically a poet that teachers used. You don't always see this, and the poems that you see in basal readers, often if not, you will not find anybody that is, anything older than the 1960s. You really have to search in some cases. You may get a little bit of Robert Frost. You may get a little bit of Carl Sandburg, but it's very rare that you get some of the other classic poetry way before that, and sometimes difficult to find. And to close off at least the the theoretical stuff here. Quote from Tolkien: "Children are meant to grow up, not to become Peter Pans, not to lose innocence and wonder, but to proceed on the appointed journey, that journey upon which it is certainly not better to travel hopefully than to arrive. So we must travel hopefully if we are to arrive." A few ideas of what we're doing at the Academy then, and then I'll open it up at least for some questions. We have grades preschool basically for 8th grade in our literature program. Preschool and kindergarten do a lot of reading alouds. We have a long list of books that we ask their teachers to read to them. A lot of the fairy tales, a lot of Robert Louis Stevenson's books for the younger ones. A lot of the poetry and fairy tales, a lot of the Mother Goose, a lot of that in the early years. As we move on through the grades, the fairy tales probably stop around 4th grade. I think Grimm is finished off in 4th grade. And then at that point, well, even in 3rd grade, they start some of the Greek and Roman mythology. The mythology is carried through, they skip 4th grade, but then it is carried through 5 through 8. The Arthurian tales are done in 4th grade. So you get your Robin Hood and your King Arthur and that sort of thing there. I was amazed to find out how many places there are references to Robin Hood. In my class this year had no idea, some of them, who Robin Hood was. Robin Hood showed up in Ivanhoe as Robin of Locksley. It took him a long time to figure out who he was. And we let him struggle with that for a while. Adventures of Tom Sawyer refers to Robin Hood. All of a sudden, there's a whole section where Tom Sawyer and his buddies go out and act out the adventures of Robin Hood, and some of these kids are scratching their head going, who is Robin Hood? What is this all about? And so there are important things. Some of the kids actually went to the library, checked out a book, Robin Hood, so they knew what it was talking about. And so these things occur. But those are some of the basics that we knew had to be really in stone, that they had to have. And the kids enjoy the fairy tales. We still deal with kids that know different versions. The Disney version sometimes, it's often is off. The Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales have been incredible when they've been going through those. So there's a lot in there for children to learn, and not one of them have found it boring. We do read all of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia between between, I believe, 2nd and 8th grade. If it's not a read aloud, then the children are reading it in class. So it's moved through that. We also have some of the Laura Ingalls Wilder's books through the grades. So some of the kids, if they're not hearing it, they're reading it. But I don't believe we go through all of those. 7th and 8th grade, we get them into the real Shakespeare. We put them into, some of the Last of the Mohicans they read this year. And that's probably the grade that's farthest behind because it was the last implemented. It is the hardest probably for some of them in many cases because they haven't had a lot of the things coming up to this point. And so sometimes they struggle a little bit more. We also have developed an honors list. We have a few students at this point which are getting to the point. I had one this year that had read everything in 4th grade, so we put him in 5th grade literature. I found a problem with that. I thought he reads well, he sounds like he knows what he's doing, but he couldn't do the reasoning that we were doing in 5th and 6th grade. He could tell me all the facts, but he had the literal comprehension down, he read fluently, but it was a lot more difficult for him. He just wasn't ready for it. Some students are, some aren't. And so many have moved on and we realize that we have a problem. We're going to need to do something when they get beyond and they maybe read the 7th and 8th grade list already and they're ready for something more challenging. So we've developed an honors list. At this point, we haven't yet had to put it into practice, but it is there. We also realized another problem. What do you do with students that aren't reading at grade level? I have some students in 5th and 6th grade that were, not many, but a couple that were reading at a 3rd grade reading level when I got them. Sometimes they've transferred in. Sometimes they just have learning problems. They aren't able to do it. And we decided that, well, what are we going to do? We need a remedial reading program, don't we? Well, how are we going to do that? Now, in some cases, it works out fine. I can use, especially if the child is transferred in, I can use the 3rd grade reading material with him. He does the 3rd grade literature program. and we just meet at a different time. Sometimes that works, but what do you do with the child that's been behind? I can't use third grade reading material with a child that's already been here since third grade. Now, sometimes there is some wisdom to the fact that you can reread a book. It's worth rereading, and you may learn something again. But for some children, sometimes it's maybe not so much the literature they need more work on the decoding. For some reason, they're still struggling with it. Now, a series that works really well, this is probably the only one that I will plug, is one that's called Direct Instruction, put out by SRA. Do not like the early years part where they change the print and they do things. They have a different way of teaching phonics. The cross between phonics and sight reading is kind of unusual. But they do use literature, but it's paraphrased, summarized, but they do a nice job of a remedial reading program in which they work slowly with the students and they work on a lot of the decoding skills for those that are just struggling. And we're working this year, we have like a special ed teacher or tutor that will work with those children who just can't do it. They just can't do the regular program that we're doing because they're falling behind. Some of them will eventually catch up. Some of them probably never will. I have one young man who is classified as mildly mentally retarded. He will never achieve where we want him to, but that doesn't mean that he can't have some of the good literature and some of the good stories. Some of the best things for him were some of the fairy tales that we did this year with him. So there are many different ways, and we've run into problems, and we've had to sit back and change things. So we're by no means where we want to be. It is a process of having to reevaluate and change things. So thank you. Any questions that you may have? Yes, ma'am. It depends how far behind are they. At this point, if a child, now I know what I've got coming into 5th grade this year. Now some of them are just lazy. They need to be pushed and kicked and prodded all along, and I will have to do that. Some will struggle, but they still can make it. They're going to have to push, but they will make it. And there are others that we know already, they're just too far behind and they won't. We have tried to keep them with us. For example, when I did Greek and Roman mythology, the one young man that was at a 3rd grade level, I gave him the 3rd grade book that was actually Delaire's Greek mythology. He used that while we used the Edith Hamilton book. He was doing the same thing at the same time, but it was just a different book. That sometimes works, but other times, if they're so far beyond, you really need some sort of a pull-up program. I know that's the bad word to say, but it's the best thing for them. Some students really do well if they have one-on-one. They need that, and they will excel and maybe even eventually be able to rejoin a class somewhere down the road. Sometimes that just is the best way for them, and if that's going to be good for them, that's what we need to do. It is best for the rest of the class if it's a pull-out, because that means you can keep going, you can keep sailing. Now, in a small school, we struggle with funds to find a tutor, someone who is capable. We have an excellent woman, we're very fortunate, who is very capable of doing this. And so right now it's a matter of negotiating how many hours can we get you a week. So that's probably been our biggest struggle, besides the fact of having to go through and change literature and what we don't have in our curriculum. Looking for the good things and finding the jewels here and there. And by no means are there books out there that we don't have everything. There are many books that we have missed, that people have said to us, you don't have this. Why don't you have this? And they're like, well, unfortunately, none of us thought about it. We're glad you brought it to attention. Then we try to, if it works out, to work it in some place. Yes. I'm probably a really bad person to ask. I burn both ends of the candle, so I know what you mean. It is something that somehow we need to stress with families. We did start the Accelerated Reader Program, where we also customized our discs because they didn't always have the classics on a particular disc that we want. We got those in, and we offer prizes, and sometimes that encourages the children to read. And I require book reports from a required reading list, I forget the word, it might be supplementary list, but they have to pick off there, and I probably have gotten the most gripes from that from children because we don't have all those books in our school library. We're working on it, but we don't have that. And they have to go to the library. They have to get the books. They have to read it. And it is difficult, but the problem is more and more parents don't have time to read with their children. And I don't know how we can make it more important. I realize it because, you know, you're with students every day. You see that it needs to be done. But there's just not enough time. And unfortunately, they recognize the fact in the research that if the parents don't do it, it falls on us. But there's only so much you can do. And the problem is knowing when to draw that line and not feeling guilty. And unfortunately, as teachers, you always feel guilty because there's always more to do. But I did forget to tell you one thing. I found an incredible site on the Internet in my research. It is, hold on one second, I get it. Okay, it's www.educ.ucalgary, CALGARY.ca/LITINDEX. I know it's long. What this is from University of Calgary. They have a literature list on there. It's called the Duché list, and you know, books that they keep in their library and things like this. But it's a whole children's literature site. They've got a lot of garbage on there, a lot of good stuff on there. You type in the title of a book, and they've got it linked to lesson plans, vocabulary, worksheets, tests, you name it. I found one for The Hobbit, which is this year. I already have one. Now, didn't read it, don't know if it's any good. I'll have to go through that. But somebody's done the work already. It will save you time. And that's the biggest complaint from our teachers. That's why it's so hard to get teachers at a classical school. No one wants to do all this work. We haven't been trained classically. Probably the worst thing is we find out how much we don't know. Well, I don't know anything about that. And so it takes you time to learn it. And that's the worst thing is the prep time. How do you balance prep time with grading? You know, you can't grade less. The less you grade, the less they do. They know that. They're smart. And so you have to grade more. You have to collect more. There's a lot more reading involved. You know, they have to write out answers. But there are sites here that will give it. Actually, this was a publisher site they sent me to for The Hobbit. Actually, had a picture of our book, the same publisher. I think it was Ballantine. And there were all the lesson plans. And just a hint for teachers, if you go to it's a magazine called Cable in the Classroom, and there's A&E and the History Channel. If you go to their websites, they sometimes offer teachers money for their lesson plans and ideas. I've never done this. I was told about this. And you can send it in, and they'll pay you. And sometimes they only get one or two teachers that send information in. So it's, you know, it's not that difficult. But there are places where there are a lot of things out there. And sometimes it's just nice for someone else who's picked out the vocab for you. Maybe words you haven't hit, saves you time. But sometimes you know your students. You know what they need and what they have to have. Thank you very much.